Hi, good afternoon. I'm Harvey Belovski, the Senior Rabbi of the Golden Spring Synagogue, and it's a pleasure to be back with you discussing a rather unusual Pesach topic. I have called the class this afternoon Whisky for the Four Cups. Is it credible in any shape or form that instead of using wine or grape juice at your Seder for the four cups, they could use whiskey? Now, I rather think that if you're using appropriate quantity, remember it's a celebratory cup, not just a sip, 4 large cups of whiskey might finish you off altogether. But let's, in theory, investigate this subject. Of course, this is a way of exploring the parameters of what constitutes chametz. Is whiskey chametz? Now, that might seem very obvious. Whiskey starts life as some kind of mash made from grain, probably barley, which is inherently chametz. You take barley, you mix it with water. That is the definition of chametz once a certain number of minutes have passed. So how could it be that whiskey isn't chametz? What is Belovski talking about? Well, here goes. Let's begin with some sources. In the end, ultimately, all of these issues have been discussed before by some of the greatest early thinkers, and we just have to apply it to whiskey. Now, it's important to understand that distillates like whiskey were not known in the time of the Talmud. Distillation was discovered in the medieval period, long after the Talmud had been written. So we're going to have to make some assumptions and look at sources that postdate the invention of distillation. In the meantime, they certainly had beer. Now, beer is not quite the same as whiskey, but nonetheless, it is a derivative from a chametz source. So let's see. Let's begin with the source. I hope you can see the source sheet. I will highlight the bits that I'm going to be covering. Here is our starting source, which is an excerpt from the Talmud and the Tractate Pesachim, which deals with Pesach. And there's a translation, and I'm going to kind of read it as I go along, and I hope you can follow. So there's background noise, which I'm trying to get rid of. So thank you. Omri Abahu, Omri Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Yisurim Shebatorah, Ein Lokin Aleim Ela Derech Achiloson. So the way the Gemara discusses this concept is that it talks about flogging. Now, we don't really do a lot of flogging. It's not very fashionable, but it's a way of saying a biblical prohibition. Everything in the Torah that is biblically forbidden, you only transgress the biblical prohibition if you eat it derech achiloson, in the way they're normally eaten. By the way, as an aside, this excerpt has a big impact on medication. Medication that is swallowed whole is not considered eating. When you eat, you put the food in your mouth, you chew it, you taste the flavor, and you swallow it. Swallowing something whole is not derech achiloson, and many halachis, including some of the most stringent, accept the view that when you swallow something whole, it's not eating, and therefore the rules governing what medicines that are swallowed whole require Pesach supervision are much more lenient than, say, medicines that are chewed or taken as a suspension. That's another conversation, but it's also relevant to this passage. What is this excluding, asks the Talmud. Omarav Shimi Bar Ashi Lemiuti Shim Ochel Chelev Chai gives an example. For example, if you were to eat raw fat, now certain sorts of fat, tallow, are biblically forbidden, and it's normal to cook them before eating. Eating it raw is probably absolutely disgusting. But that's just the point. If you eat it, that's not the normal way people eat it, although you shouldn't do it. It's not the full-blown biblical prohibition, because it's not being consumed in the way the product is normally eaten. Shapoto, you're exempt. After these dots, on Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera said, Af anan nami taninu. We've also learnt something similar. Ein sokin saraboy mishum orla ela yotzim azeis min anovim bilvad. When it comes to orla, the first 3 years of a tree's growth are forbidden, and what's forbidden is what actually emerges from the olives or from the grapes, meaning the juice itself. But when it comes to juice from strawberries, figs or pomegranates, no, not prohibited. My time, what's the reason? Isn't this because this is not the way they're normally eaten? People extract juice from olives, we call that olive oil, and they extract juice from grapes, but it is not normal practice to extract juice from strawberries from figs or pomegranates. Actually, it's become popular to make pomegranate juice, but it wasn't in the time of the Talmud. And so this is the beginning. We just need a little bit more of this. Omer Abaya said to his colleague, well, The fruit, if you say, I eat the fruit in an unusual way, perhaps the fruit's raw, but it's normally cooked, or it's prepared in an unusual way. Shopper, that would work. Elahocha. Here, the reason is Mishum Dezea Ba'almahu. Now, please remember this. It's mere moisture. Maybe some produce are squeezed for juice, and that's the normal way of eating it. Sometimes a bit of juice that runs out is not considered to be sufficiently part of the product itself. This phrase, zea literally means sweat. It's not a very pleasant translation. It's translated here in a rather more genteel fashion as moisture. We're going to distinguish between something which is the product itself and moisture. Moisture, how we define it, or sweat as it's more accurately translated, isn't the product itself. It's too distant. It's not the thing itself. It's not the thing itself. Maybe, just maybe, it won't be considered to be chametz. However, here we have another excerpt from another passage in the Talmud. I'll just read it in English. That was taught in the Brisa. Brisa is a text that is not in the Mishnah, in the code of the oral Torah that was put together in the late 2nd century, but it's contemporaneous with it. With regard to untithed produce, which you're not allowed to eat, chodosh, the new crop, which you can't eat till after Pesach, and consecrated produce, things which are set aside for temple use, produce sabbatical year, relevant, we are in a Shavia sabbatical year, and kilayim are mixtures that are forbidden. These are all things, agricultural products that are forbidden. Mashkin hayotze mehem kamoson, liquid that comes out of them are considered the same as the product. That means the liquid has the same rule as the product itself. So where's the boundary line between liquid that comes out of a forbidden product, which is prohibited, and liquid that somehow is so distant it just sweat, zea ba'alma, sweat or moisture, and may well be permitted. So the Rambam, Maimonides in his code, explores this a little, and gives us a few rules. Again, I'm going to just read it in English for you. We're now at the bottom of page 1, if you have the source sheet. The juices that come from produce that is tevel, that's untithed, chodosh, new grain, consecrated to the temple, growth of the sabbatical year, kilayim, that's forbidden, which is all the first 3 years. These are all agricultural products that one may not eat as they are. Right? You're not allowed to eat them as they are, as they come off the tree or off the plant. One is not, however, liable for lashes, meaning forbidden, for partaking of them, exceptions of wine and oil that are oil and wine that is kilaya karim. These are complex constructs, but wine and oil are normal ways of using olives. In fact, in ancient times, it was much more common to use olives to make oil and grapes to make wine than it was to eat them raw. We have become used to olives and white grapes, but they weren't done so. If you ever see a merlot grape, it's not very nice to eat. It makes great wine, but it's not a great fruit to have at your dinner. So the most important thing is, just as you are forbidden to eat these things, you're forbidden to eat the liquid that comes out of the olives and grapes. They're just the same. So the Rambam codifies this. Now, we're going to see in later sources, as we move through pages 2, and don't worry, there are only 3 pages of sources, a lot of anxiety about the state of a distillate. Let's pause for a moment and consider how whiskey is made. A mash is made from barley with water, and this ferments. The fermented mash is then distilled. It's heated in a still, and what happens is that the liquid, as it heats, is captured by a kind of tube, and that liquid condenses into a separate container. This is basic distillation. It is what is today called, but at GCSE and in my time, O-level chemistry. So this is how distillation works. Now, is there any of the original physical material? When you crush the grapes and you crush the olives, then there are particles of grapes and olives in it. Of course, we strain it. No one wants olive oil with lumps in it, or grapes with pips or skin in it. We filter it. But it feels like it's the grape or the olive itself. What is the story about a distillate where all the solids are left behind and a clear liquid which has first been heated, then by hitting the sides of the container evaporates, and then is collected in another container? Is this considered to be a liquid that emerges from the fruit, like squeezing a grape juice or wine, squeezing an olive oil? Is this effectively barley juice? And barley is forbidden on Pesach, and therefore whiskey is a biblically forbidden substance, just as these other things? Or is it something different? So here I introduce you to Rabbi Yehoshua Falk, one of the greatest Talmudic commentators of the 17th century, the Pnei Yehoshua, as his book is called. And he's talking really about a quite obscure subject at the end of the tractate Kiddushin, about Chodosh, about the new grain, which isn't eaten until after the second day of Pesach. But we don't need to worry about that, because in the course of his deliberation, he says something very controversial, and really, which gave me the title of the shir. D'chol mashkin hayotzim ma'oichle dekechoshiv luhu zeh ba'almo guri'i tefei meha'oicha shaloi kederech achiloso oy shalerech hanoso. Let me translate bit by bit. I know you have a translation beneath, but let me just read it to you. Every liquid that emerges from a foodstuff that is regarded as only moisture or sweat, meaning it's quite distant from the original product. Guri tfei meha oichel. This is a much lower level concern than a food that is eaten not in the normal way of eating. Remember, in the first source it said if you took forbidden fat and you ate it raw, which no normal person does, that was not considered eating it in the normal way. Or you don't eat it in the way one normally derives benefit. The zeya, this extract, is a lower level category, meaning, according to Rabbi Yehoshua Falk, the Pnei Yehoshua, this substance, which is just sweat, if you like, is not even considered to be eating a food not in the normal way. It's a lower level still than this. So what is its status? I think there's a very, very good reason to say that the distillate is an example. It is extracted, it derives from a chometz source. But is it the squashed barley? It's not. The squashed barley then goes through another process to produce a liquid which ostensibly has only the remotest connection with its original source. That means, according to Pnei Yehoshua, I believe, that whiskey fits into the category of zeya ba'almo, meaning it's not even an extract, it's a lower level still. It's something which is much less of a concern because it is so distant from the original product. So what is the status in Jewish law, therefore, of the distillate, the whiskey? According to the opinions of the commentators and the majority of halachic decisors, legal rulers, when something is not eaten in its normal way, it's not the normal way to derive benefit from barley. Well, eat barley, put it in the cholent. But you don't mash it, heat it, ferment it, and then distill it. That's not considered the normal way of using barley by Jewish law. Ein boy issa deraisa kla. There is no biblical prohibition at all. Now, this needs to be unpicked very carefully. I do not want to create the wrong impression. He does not say it's permitted. Pnei Yehoshua says there is no biblical prohibition. It means he thinks there's a rabbinic prohibition. So I'm really sorry to break the bad news. This is the spoiler. Even the outlying opinion of the Pnei Yehoshua, which is interesting and I think really fascinating. He will not allow you to use whiskey for 4 cups, because even if it's biblically not chametz, the rabbis will not allow it for what I imagine you can consider very good and sensible reasons. So I'm sorry, if you want to tune out now because it's all over, the answer is you may not use whiskey for your 4 cups. But this is so interesting. This is the kind of thing that keeps rabbis up at night. Whiskey, according to the Bnei Yehoshua, is not biblical chametz. The rabbis jump in to say it's unwise to drink and you shouldn't have it. But because of the way whiskey is distant so many steps from the original product, it's considered zeya ba'almo, mere sweat, mere moisture, and therefore ein boy issa deraisa klal. There is no biblical prohibition whatever. Now, this position is often not disclosed by some of the later sources considering the subject. Lots of commentators talk about this subject, and none of them adopt the marginal outlying opinion of Pnei Yehoshua. They argue with it. And I realized when I looked at these sources a long time ago, all of them are arguing with it. They must be arguing with something. They're not just telling you randomly, oh, by the way, whiskey is chametz. Unless someone, turns out to Pnei Yehoshua, was saying, that it isn't actually chametz. And I'll tell you in a minute, you might think, well, this is all academic. Belovski's wasted our time telling us that you can't drink whiskey on Pesach. We knew that already. And some rabbis think that it's only rabbinically forbidden, and some say it's biblically forbidden. What difference does it make? You can't have it anyway. What was the point of spending my lunchtime listening to this guy talking about this? I'll tell you in a minute. But we're not quite there. Here's the Chacham Tzvi. Let me introduce you to Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, who was the rabbi in Amsterdam in the 18th century. Extremely well known. The Chacham Tzvi is the name of his collection of letters responding to halachic issues, and in the Chacham Tzvi, he addresses this question. I've got some bullet points here, but look at the Hebrew text. Kusha de Milsa, leke ben isura gufa lemashka yotze mehem. V'orla. Sorry, there. Aval kusha de Milsa, leke ben isura gufa lemashka hayotze mehem. There is no distinction at all between the object itself and any liquid which is extracted from it. And he talks about some exceptions, which I don't think we need to go into. And he said, and when the rabbis talk about some distinction about here, what bracha do you make? So he said, what bracha do you make on date honey? Date, you say the bracha, borei peri ha'eit, to go on a tree. But if you eat date honey, silan as it's called, silan you say shahakoil. It's considered to distant. So this conversation, which treats the liquid as different from the product, its thing itself, that's an issue of brachas. That's about what blessing to say on it. It says, well, why is that? It's just there. But Alma, don't be fooled into thinking this is an existential conversation. This is just, as the Chacham Tzvi, about which bracha to say it. A drop of silan, you say the bracha, the catch all bracha sha'akol. But on the date from which it came, you say borei peri. It's hana dafka le'inyan bracha to lo mikri peri. Because when you say borei peri ha'eit, that God creates the fruit of the tree, it's not a fruit, it's a liquid, it doesn't look like a fruit. So, and it's not the normal way in which dates are processed. Aval le'inyan isur. But when it comes to prohibition, i.e., how do we categorize liquids that have been extracted in any way from forbidden products? When we really follow that it has a taste, the answer is the liquid is just the same as the object itself. And therefore, I've missed out a bit, which is why it says nonetheless. For those who are following in the Hebrew, that means nonetheless. When it comes to the prohibition of chometz, it is absolutely clear. When he says dover boro, it's really, really clear. It means he knows he's arguing with someone who says otherwise, that the liquid that is extracted from the chometz, and here's the key bit, bein al yedei bishul, whether through cooking, which of course is distillation, is a type of cooking. You heat the fermented mash to produce the distillate, which will then condense into another container. Ben ali de schita, whether you squeeze the mash, it's just the fruit, it's the thing itself. So the Chacham Tzvi says distilled mash has the same rules as the barley, and therefore, according to the Chacham Tzvi, it is clear that whiskey is full-blown biblical chometz, just as we thought before we started. Anyway, and he spends some time thinking about this, about how it compares, and then he talks about something here called it hamolitz, about what we do about this molitz. Shayayin sarf nasa memena. Now, malts or malts is probably malt. I'm not absolutely sure. He's clearly using a word from maybe from Dutch or possibly from German or maybe from Yiddish at the time, and this means a mash from which yain sarf is technically brandy, but he probably means the distillate is produced. It is biblically forbidden, whether it comes through squeezing or whether it comes through cooking. So there we are. So the Chacham Tzvi, which is much more normative, argues with the Pnei Yeshua, and here you have the Nodi Yehuda, the greatest halachist of Prague in the mid-18th century. These are all approximately contemporaneous. The Chacham Tzvi is very slightly early. The Nodi Yehuda, Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, is in the middle of the 18th century. He's pretty much a contemporary of the son of the Chacham Tzvi. So this is quite a hard phrase. When people write that one can be lenient about whiskey because it's just moisture of no significance halachically, The earlier sources have already trampled on this, meaning they've already demonstrated that it's nonsense. But I don't want to get involved in this. It requires many deep investigations into Talmudic ideas. It's not my way. It's sociologically fascinating. It's not my way, says the Noda Yehuda, to get in, to start the work and not finish it. The Dover said panai harbe, because it requires a great deal of time to really get to the core of this subject. I wrote to Lismo me. However, somebody wants to rely on the lenient position, who's going to stop him? Meaning, while I reject it, and while I believe that the majority reject it, I cannot criticize someone who relies on it. Now, understand, relying it does not mean having 4 cups of whiskey at your Seder. Put away the Glenfiddich. We're not about to do that. What he means is to take a lenient approach, which will be relevant as mentioned here in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch considers the following conundrum. It is forbidden by rabbinic law to derive benefit from chometz that was owned by a Jew during Pesach. There's a biblical prohibition of owning chometz during Pesach. That means before Pesach we dispose of our chometz, consume it, or if one has larger quantities, it's permitted to make a sale to a non-Jew for the duration of Pesach. But if you transgress and own chometz during Pesach, the way the rabbis process this and to discourage it is by creating a prohibition. You're not allowed to get benefit from it. You can't do anything with it. It's to stop people transgressing. But that only applies to real chometz, bread, pasta. Doesn't apply to whiskey. So it depends, of course. If you hold like the Chacham Tzvi, it's actually full-blown chometz. It's no different between a bottle of whiskey and a loaf of bread. The answer is, of course, the rabbinic law applies to it. But if you hold it's something else, it's only rabbinically forbidden, it's not really edible, it's not edible from a chometz perspective, the status of such chometz, even if it's extant, meaning you can see the thing, the bottle of whiskey, it's not forbidden for benefit after Pesach, meaning if a Jew owned it during Pesach, while a bad idea, according to this, if you categorize chometz like the Pnei Yeshua as something which is probably rabbinically forbidden, there's room to say that if one failed for whatever reason to make a sale of chometz or to dispose of it, it might be permitted, unlike a loaf of bread, to use it after Pesach. However, the later sources, Shari Tshuva is a later source, and here the Shari Tshuva cites our friend the Chacham Tzvi, who was the stringent view above, about the malts. Remember, that's the mash from which the distillate is made. It's all biblically forbidden, and even if it's altered very considerably. So this is talking about a kind of distilled honey with sugar, like a kind of mead perhaps. Even though the flavor has been changed quite fundamentally through distillation or frying, I don't know how you fry this, nonetheless it remains in the same status. So what he's saying here is that even though you might ask the question, but whiskey tastes completely different from barley, it doesn't matter. It is still considered connected to the original product. In our last couple of sources here, we're going to see how this is wrapped up. Now, the Sholem Eshiv, a much later source, this is only about 100 years ago, creates a kind of compromise. Look what he says here. Aval be'emes hamaltz, spells it slightly differently. This mash, which is the product from which the distillate is made, who is at the Pesach, you're not allowed to. It's forbidden on Pesach, and you're not allowed to get benefit from it either. So, for example, I can't trade in whiskey during Pesach, even I can't trade in whiskey sell it to non-Jews. Rak, to lo avar bal yiraya, he said, but I cannot claim that you transgress the prohibition of owning chometz, because it's not really chometz. You're not allowed to eat it. You're not allowed to trade in it. But if you were to own it, I can't really say you've transgressed the prohibition. It's a kind of compromise between the two positions. And the consequence, says the Sholem Eshiv, therefore after Pesach, if you were to own it and not dispose of it and you own it during Pesach, although you can't eat it, although you can't benefit because you can't trade in it, the rules which governing the fine, i.e. the rabbis penalise people who own the chometz by telling you can't use it, don't apply. And there have been circumstances where there's quite a celebrated case from some hundreds of years ago, where a whiskey dealer found that his trade fair was on Erev Pesach, and he went off to the trade fair, and he was so consumed with his business matter that he realised that the afternoon of Pesach had come, the last time to dispose of his commons had passed, and he had a factory full of whiskey, a warehouse of whiskey, and he hadn't sold it, and he obviously feared that he'd lost the whole lot, and one could, in this case, perhaps rely on this lenient opinion. Now, the dissenting view comes from the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which I'm not going to read in detail. The Rav Shulchan Aruch written in the late 18th century. These texts are all pretty much all a product of the 18th century, except for the one we just saw. And the Shulchan Aruch Harav, this is written by the first Rebbe of Lubavitch, who is known for many things, but also as a great halachist. It's known as the Rav Shulchan Aruch. And in this text, which follows the order of the regular Shulchan Aruch, he adopts a stringent opinion. A stringent view, which I will say I think is probably fairly mainstream. And he says the following, that the liquid or the distillate that is produced from chometz, and I'm just going to read the first couple of words in the Hebrew after all, a distillate that is extracted from a chometz source, i.e. whiskey, it has the scent of the chometz itself, and therefore whiskey that is made from a mash, it's not considered a mixture of chometz. It's not something mixed with chometz, and when you have a mixture, there are certain lenient rules that apply. It is actually chometz. Your bottle of whiskey, according to the Rav Shulchan Aruch, has the same din as a loaf of bread. It is a piece, or in this case, a bottle of chometz. And he goes on to explain why this might be, and that means the following is true. There's a severe biblical prohibition of eating chometz in a certain quantity on Pesach. And he said you could transgress, unlike what we just saw in the previous source, you could transgress this severe prohibition by drinking enough whiskey. And since that is the case, then it remains a significant substance. You have to eliminate it. That means before Pesach. And it was originally floated that we'd move this in person, and we'd encourage people to bring their whiskey collections and bring them along and drink them up. I wasn't sure that was really the very best idea, particularly given the size of my whiskey cupboard. We're not encouraging binge drinking at the United Synagogue, but nonetheless, we would encourage you to finish it up. And if you can't finish it up, to give it away. And if you don't want to give it away, then to make a sale through your rabbi or through someone through the United Synagogue website, because this view says that it's real chometz. And as a result of being real chometz, it's no different to owning a packet of biscuits or a loaf of bread, which you have to get rid of it by a number of means prior to Pesach. And the consequence, of course, that is the Sorokal environment in Torah. Biblical law requires you to expunge it before Pesach. The im ovar olov ha-Pesach, and should Pesach pass over it while you still own this whiskey, meaning you failed to sell it or dispose of it, below biori, you didn't get rid of it, you're not allowed to get any benefit from it. Meaning it's just the same as if you failed to get rid of your bread collection. And so we've seen a diversity of views. This shield was constructed based, of course, on a whim. There is no permission, according to anyone, to use whiskey for the 4 cups. And there are all kinds of reasons why one would not recommend this. Probably good sense suggests this too. But it's an opportunity to explore together what chometz actually is. How far removed from the original substance? You've got the subject, then you squeeze it, and you've got the juice that comes out of it. What about a distillate? Of course, distillates weren't known, as I said, in the time of the Talmud. So it's a bit of a new construct. You've got this substance which has clearly come from whiskey, and it can come from a chometz source, and it can't exist unless it came from a chometz source. And the great sources disagree. And we've seen 3 opinions. One is it's not chometz biblically at all, although rabbinically you can't have it for good reason. A view that it is full-own biblical chometz, that's the last source we saw, in every regard, and that means you must sell it, get rid of it, drink it up, and if you own it during Pesach, I'm afraid there's nothing you can do. And an in-between position that it's forbidden, but it's forbidden such that it's not really prohibited to own it during Pesach, and as such, while it's advisable to get rid of it, should you fail to do so, it's permitted to drink it after Pesach. So, of course, as always, ask your local Orthodox rabbi what to do in practice. And sometimes these very theoretical subjects have a major impact in practice. Probably not the most radical discovery to say that Belovski has reminded you that you cannot use whiskey for your full cups, as much as you might like to do so. But wishing you and your families a Chag Kosher Sameach. Enjoy your whiskey before Pesach. If you're hanging on to it, do say it through your rabbi and enjoy it again afterwards, and have a wonderful Yom Tov.